He thought he was opening the door to just another hotel suite, but standing there wasn't a maid. It was an 8-year-old girl with a rag in her hand and a look far too serious for her age. He was ready to throw her out. But that day changed his life forever. This story isn't about wealth. It's about choice. About how one small heart quietly broke through the walls of a billionaire and gave him something money could never buy. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And tell us, do you believe that sometimes it's the children who teach us how to truly live? The morning air was colder than usual, not just in the streets of the city, but in the heart of the small basement room where Leah lived with her mother, Emma. The tiny space, tucked beneath the grand building of the Serenity Plaza Hotel, was not officially listed on any floor plan. It had once served as a storage room for old cleaning supplies, long since cleared out to make space for what Emma had quietly made into a makeshift home. It wasn't legal, it wasn't safe, but it was all they had. Leah was 8, though most would have guessed younger. Her frame was slim, her clothes slightly too large, and her eyes too old for someone so young. She had learned early that asking for help rarely brought results, and that silence, coupled with action, could often lead to survival. That morning, her mother didn't wake up for her usual early shift. Emma had worked late into the night the day before, as always, wiping away footprints that never belonged to her and collecting crumpled sheets of the wealthy who never knew her name. But when the alarm buzzed on the cracked screen of the old cell phone, Emma didn't move. Her face was flushed, her breath labored. Fever had taken hold. Leah watched in silence for a few moments, weighing everything in her small, careful mind. She glanced at the old cleaning apron hanging on the hook near the door. Her mother's ID card, long expired but still scanned by inattentive supervisors, lay on the nightstand. Emma wouldn't be going anywhere that day. If no one cleaned the assigned rooms, the management would be notified. If someone came looking for them, there could be questions they couldn't afford. So Leah made a decision. She slipped into her mother's oversized uniform, tied her dark hair into a loose ponytail, and took the rag, the same gray fraying cloth her mother always carried, and quietly stepped into the back hallway of the hotel. No one noticed her as she navigated the familiar maze. She had memorized the schedule, the faces of the cleaning staff, and the times when certain floors were usually unattended. She knew not to speak unless spoken to. She knew to keep her eyes down. Most importantly, she knew that if she did this right, they would make it through one more day. The door to room 1603 opened with a soft click. The suite was grand, the kind designed for executives and elite travelers. Leah paused for a moment on the threshold. The velvet drapes, the marble countertops, the faint scent of lavender in the air. It was all so different from the musty odor of the basement. But she didn't linger. She had come to work, not to dream. She moved methodically, mimicking her mother's every motion from memory. She folded the towels, wiped the mirrors, swept the bathroom floor. Her small hands struggled with the vacuum, but she persisted, tugging the cord gently across the room. She worked in silence, with the expression of someone not hoping to impress, but simply hoping not to be noticed. She was halfway through wiping down the coffee table when the door opened again. She didn't turn. Her mother had taught her that surprises were best handled with calm. If someone entered, she should keep working. No excuses, no explanations. Just the cloth, the task, and her silence. The man who stepped into the room was not a guest in the traditional sense. His name was Ivor Rowan, and he was the owner of the Serenity Plaza chain, a man who rarely visited his own hotels, but had done so that day on impulse. He had been delayed by a phone call, missed his car, and decided to step into one of the top-floor suites to take a breath and think. Instead, he found a small girl kneeling in front of a bucket, scrubbing the floor with an expression of practiced detachment. He expected an apology, a flurry of staff excuses, or at the very least some indication of what he was seeing. But the girl didn't look up. She simply kept scrubbing, calm, steady, as if she belonged there. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, against his usual instincts, he did not shout. He did not call security. Instead, he watched. She rinsed the cloth, wrung it out with her tiny hands, and moved to the next square of tile. Her movements were careful and precise, not hurried or sloppy. It was the way someone worked when they knew mistakes were costly. 1,000 questions spun in Oliver's mind, but the girl gave none of them room to speak. Her presence, so small and silent, filled the suite with something that felt both heavy and fragile. He found himself setting down his phone, sitting, observing. The minutes passed. 10, 15. Finally, she looked up. Her face was blank, almost expressionless, but her eyes met his with quiet certainty. There was no fear in them, no shame, only a steady, honest presence that unnerved him more than any confrontation ever had. Later, when he questioned the hotel's manager, the truth unraveled piece by piece. Emma, the mother, had been removed from the payroll months ago, but continued to work unofficially, paid in tips, ignored by supervisors, and quietly forgotten. No one knew she had been living in the basement. No one had noticed the child. The room had been repurposed after a renovation, and Emma had begged for the key just to have a place to sleep. They hadn't stolen anything. Nothing was missing. In fact, some of the other staff mentioned that certain rooms had been cleaned better than usual in recent weeks. Oliver said nothing as he stood in the narrow doorway of that basement room later that afternoon. The air was stale, the walls too close together, the mattress too thin. But what struck him most was the smallness of everything. The size of the toothbrush in the corner, the tiny shoes beside the door, the drawing taped to the cabinet, a house, a dog, and a girl holding hands with someone taller. He went back upstairs and found the girl still working, now organizing the toiletries in the bathroom. She had not been told to stay. No one had asked her to keep going, but she had returned as if this were her job, as if she believed it still mattered. Oliver stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her work. The world outside his head, deals, meetings, construction sites, seemed to hush into something slower, something clearer. The girl finished wiping the sink and sat back on her heels. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before reaching into her pocket and pulling out a crumpled napkin, which she carefully unfolded and laid across the counter, her makeshift way of finishing the job. He left without a word. That night, he didn't attend the board dinner. He sat in his penthouse with a legal pad in hand, not for notes, not for numbers, but to write something he hadn't written in years, a letter. He didn't know to whom yet, maybe to the city's welfare department, maybe to a hospital, maybe to the girl herself. But something had changed. He wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet. But it began with a rag and the silence of a girl who knew exactly what she was doing and didn't need permission to be brave. The following day unfolded not in boardrooms, nor among high-rise blueprints or scheduled investor calls, but in the quiet corridors of the Serenity Plaza's operational levels, the part of the hotel empire few ever saw, even fewer acknowledged. Oliver Rowan had always considered himself a man of systems, a master of strategy, someone who delegated compassion to foundations and left personal involvement to those who had time. Yet, that morning, his elevator bypassed the executive lounge entirely and descended into the utilitarian underbelly of his flagship property to find a woman and a girl he could no longer ignore. Emma's condition was worse than he had expected. The clinic nurse who had come to assess her, summoned discreetly by Oliver's assistant, confirmed high fever, shallow breathing, and visible signs of fatigue that extended far beyond a single sleepless night. She needed immediate medical care. It wasn't a question of kindness anymore. It was necessity. Oliver arranged a private room at a nearby clinic, not because it was grand, but because it was safe. Transport was handled quietly, a private van with a medical team. Emma was lifted gently onto the stretcher. She didn't speak, not from shock, but exhaustion. The woman hadn't had proper sleep in days, perhaps weeks, only brief moments of collapse between shifts. As she was moved out of the hidden corner that had served as her home, Oliver noticed her fingers twitch briefly toward her daughter's hand, a final gesture before she surrendered to sleep. Leia stood beside the van, not crying, not resisting. She simply watched. She watched her mother leave and did not ask where or for how long. Her hands were folded tightly around a small, threadbare satchel. Inside, Oliver would later discover, were colored pencils, a torn notebook, and a single sheet of neatly folded paper with numbers scrawled on it, the room cleaning checklist her mother had used for months. He arranged for Leia to stay in a guest suite, not one of the opulent penthouses, but something modest, quiet, and safe. The walls were white, the windows overlooked the city, and the sheets were warm and clean. A member of staff delivered new clothes, shoes in her size, and a bag of essentials. Leia said nothing. She simply stepped inside, looked around once, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed as if waiting for permission to exhale. Oliver returned to his office that evening, intending to catch up on work. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline, a view he had designed himself, but his eyes did not settle on the glowing sprawl of buildings. Instead, they focused inward, tracing the image of the girl kneeling in a hotel room, her hands red from scrubbing, her silence louder than any plea for help. For the first time in years, the spreadsheets remained unopened. His email count climbed. The red notification bubbles multiplied. Yet, his attention remained fixed on the quiet. Over the next several days, his routine shifted. Meetings were delayed. Conference calls were shortened or rescheduled entirely. His executive assistant grew concerned, noting the unfamiliar pattern in his calendar. Oliver didn't explain. Instead, he found himself pausing near the children's clothing store on the walk from his apartment. He found himself asking the hotel chef to prepare simple meals, nothing too rich, and then walking them up himself to room 910, where Leia now quietly resided. She was always seated at the small desk by the window, coloring or writing. She did not ask for anything. She did not complain. She accepted what she was given, not as a gift, but as a condition of continued usefulness. There was no expectation in her posture, only readiness, to adapt, to serve, to not be a burden. Oliver began sitting with her in the evenings. At first, these visits were silent. He would leave a plate on the nightstand, maybe a juice box, and watch her from the armchair across the room. She would eat in silence, then return to her sketchbook. Gradually, she began placing the pages where he could see them, drawings of hotel rooms, cleaning carts, her mother resting. One day, she drew a dog. It was small and fluffy, with an oversized tongue and a crooked tail. The dog sat beside a girl with a mop. Above it, in careful block letters, she had written, "He helps." He didn't know if she meant the dog or him. He didn't ask. Leia's silence did not come from fear. Oliver had encountered enough trauma in his philanthropic work to know the signs. She wasn't hiding pain. She was hiding belief, the belief that things could change, that someone might choose her, that anyone might care without conditions. Her emotional armor was built not from abuse but from neglect, from years of being overlooked, invisible, tolerated only when she stayed quiet and cleaned well. The drawing stayed with him for hours after he left that evening. He folded it and placed it inside the notebook where he kept personal thoughts he rarely wrote down. That night, for the first time since he could remember, he slept restlessly, not from anxiety, not from pressure, but from a deep ache of uncertainty. Something about the girl made him question the systems he had trusted for so long, that order solved chaos, that efficiency replaced emotion, that performance justified presence. Emma's condition stabilized after 3 days in the clinic. Her lungs cleared, her temperature dropped, and her voice returned, though weak and strained. She asked after her daughter with the desperation of someone who had never once left her alone. When the nurse reassured her that Leia was safe, Emma simply wept, not from fear, but relief. Oliver visited her without fanfare. He entered the private room, stood beside the bed, and introduced himself not as the owner of the hotel, but as the man who had seen her daughter working. Emma looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale. She apologized, not for the conditions she had endured, but for letting Leia take her place. Oliver didn't respond. He simply nodded. He had no words for the helplessness of watching a child step into adult responsibility while the world looked away. He returned to the hotel that evening and found Leia asleep on the couch, her sketchbook still open beside her. One hand clutched a crumpled napkin as if it were something precious. He gently pulled the blanket over her, then picked up the notebook. On the page, she had drawn a new picture. This time, there was a man in a suit holding the girl's hand. Behind them was not a hotel, but a simple house. A sign above the door read, "Home." There were no names, no smiles, just lines. But those lines said everything. Oliver set the book down and sat back in the chair. He had built empires. He had signed billion-dollar contracts. He had raised towers of glass and steel. But this quiet, unspoken bond, it unsettled him. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it felt real. He didn't know what the next step was, not yet, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. Days passed with a stillness that didn't resemble inaction, but rather the quiet unfolding of something unfamiliar. Oliver Rowan, a man defined by speed, by negotiation, by the relentless pursuit of corporate dominance, found himself delaying meetings, shifting priorities, and waking each morning not with the weight of financial forecasts on his chest, but with a single thought: the girl in room 910. The hotel was still functioning. His empire was intact. Business thrived. But inside him, something cracked and rearranged itself. It began with simple acts: asking his driver to take a longer route past the clinic to check if Emma's window curtain had been drawn back, stopping by the hotel kitchen to ask if they had packed a child-sized lunch, making time, actual, blocked-off time, to sit beside Leia while she colored. What struck him most wasn't the silence she offered, it was her quiet consistency. She never demanded, never intruded, never reached beyond what had been placed in front of her. but her presence lingered, becoming something constant in a life where everything else was negotiable. When Emma began to recover, she was moved to a transitional care facility near the hotel. Oliver had selected it personally, not the most expensive one, not even the most luxurious, but the one where the staff looked people in the eye when they spoke. She resisted at first, guilt pouring from her like a second illness. She apologized often, reflexively, as if a kindness toward her required repayment. She thanked him with too many words and flinched when he waved them away. Her biggest worry wasn't herself. It was Leah. Oliver watched from the side as the mother and daughter reunited in a room that smelled of antiseptic and hope. The hug between them was tight, desperate, unbroken. Leah buried her face into Emma's chest and didn't move. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Oliver quietly stepped out, letting the moment belong to them. Later that evening, back in the guest suite, Leah sat at the small table, organizing her new set of pencils by color. Oliver, seated across from her, noticed the faint smudges of pink and orange on her knuckles. She was trying to recreate a sunrise she had once written in a sketch caption, something she had never really seen from the basement. Without thinking, he reached for his phone to cancel a board call. At the clinic, Emma struggled with the new arrangement. She feared dependency, felt uncomfortable with generosity she couldn't return. But Leah had begun to glow, not with sudden joy or childish excitement, but with a quiet steadiness. Her eyes lifted more often. She looked out windows. She began drawing not just objects, but emotions. One afternoon, Oliver sat with Emma in her room. She had grown stronger, enough to sit upright and speak without strain. She confessed that she felt like a burden, that she had failed her daughter, that she didn't understand why he was doing any of it. He didn't give her a polished answer. In truth, he didn't have one. All he knew was that the girl had changed him. Not with demands or stories, but by existing in a world he had never paused long enough to see. He told Emma that her daughter had reminded him of something he didn't realize he'd lost: the capacity to care beyond transaction. That night, he found Leah standing at the window of her suite, staring down at the glowing streets below. Her hands were folded behind her back. When he entered, she didn't move, but on the small table behind her, a new drawing lay unfinished. It showed the lobby of the hotel, vast and marbled, but filled with something unusual. People, smiling. Someone had placed a flower on the front desk. A child was holding a mop. And a man in a suit stood in the background, not giving orders, but watching. A week later, Oliver rescheduled a major international trip. His assistant was stunned. He offered no explanation. Instead, he spent the morning driving Leah to a small local school, speaking with the principal, sitting through the registration process like any parent would. He provided his ID, signed forms, and filled in a blank that made him pause. Guardian relationship. After a second of hesitation, he wrote, temporary. Back at the hotel, he called his legal advisor. The conversation was short, uncertain. The lawyer asked whether Oliver was prepared for the complications: home inspections, social worker visits, psychological evaluations. This was not a charitable act. This was not PR. This was real life. It had rules, responsibilities, paper trails. Oliver said he understood. But the truth was, he didn't. Not fully. What he understood was the feeling in his chest when Leah tugged gently on his sleeve before bed to ask if he could check the closet for monsters. He understood the weight of her head when it rested against his arm during cartoons. He understood that for the first time, he didn't want his evenings back. He wanted them to continue, exactly like this. Each night, after Leia had gone to sleep, he sat in the living room and looked through the papers his lawyer had sent over. He hadn't signed them yet. There was no rush, he told himself. They had time. He needed to be sure, but certainty, he was learning, wasn't born in confidence. It was born in moments. One evening, Leia handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a list written in the careful, crooked handwriting of a child. At the top, it read, "Things I wish." It wasn't long. One day to make pizza, go to the park. You to sit with me without your phone. For me to have a real name. For you to choose me, not just help me. He read the list several times. His throat tightened. Then, at the bottom of the page, he took a pen and added his own line. I already have. In the days that followed, he began calling her school in the mornings to confirm attendance. He bought her first pair of rain boots. He learned which cereal she liked. He began rearranging meetings, not out of obligation, but out of choice. She never called him father. Not yet. But one night, while placing her blanket back over her small frame, she reached out sleepily and took his hand. She didn't speak. She just held it. And in that moment, no signature in the world could have meant more. The first signs of spring arrived quietly, not with sudden warmth, but with subtle invitations. Longer sunlight through the hotel windows, the fresh scent of rain on the pavement, the way children's laughter began to echo once more through the nearby park. In Oliver Rowan's life, the season's shift mirrored something far more profound. The slow, deliberate transformation of a man who had never before known what it meant to be needed beyond a signature. Leia's presence had become the anchor to his days, though she never asked for that role. She moved through the world lightly, respectfully, but her influence was quietly undeniable. Mornings now began not with market reports or calendar alerts, but with a gentle knock on her door, her sleepy face peeking out, a soft murmur of, "I'm up," even before he could speak. She had her routine: breakfast, the backpack check, the quick hug, always brief, never requested, but always given. And each evening, without fail, she returned to the suite with new drawings, new stories, and that same quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this life wasn't temporary after all. At the clinic, Emma continued to improve. The doctors spoke positively, cautiously. She had regained her strength, her color, her voice, but the strain of years of exhaustion lingered. Oliver visited often, always without entourage, always without fuss. They spoke less now, not because of distance, but because words were no longer required. Emma understood what was happening between him and Leia. She saw it not as a replacement of herself, but as something she never thought her daughter would find: safety. It was Leia who one day returned from school and placed a sealed envelope on Oliver's desk. Inside was a copy of her updated school records. One line had changed. Under surname, the name Rowan was printed neatly, without hesitation. She had not asked. She had chosen. For Oliver, the meaning of family had been redefined by that single action. But even with that quiet acceptance, he knew he had to make it real, legal, permanent. He called his lawyer the following morning and requested that the paperwork be prepared, not for temporary guardianship, but for permanent adoption. He didn't hesitate this time. He had already lived the answer. The process was slower than he expected. There were background checks, home visits, psychological assessments, school reports, but Oliver approached each one with the same determination he once reserved for global ventures. He didn't delegate. He didn't outsource. He attended every meeting. He filled every form. He opened every door. Social workers visited the suite, noting the stack of children's books on the nightstand, the refrigerator adorned with drawings, the shoebox filled with worn-down crayons. They asked questions. He answered simply. They observed Leah, how she leaned into his presence, how her eyes followed him without fear, how she called out to him across the room not by name, but by tone, the way a daughter speaks to her father without saying the word. When the adoption was finalized, no ceremony was needed. There was no crowd, no press release, just Oliver, Leah, a notary, and a single signature, one that meant more than any he had ever given. Leah didn't cry when he told her. She simply placed her hand over his and whispered the words she had only ever written before. "Thank you for staying." Life didn't transform overnight, but it changed in hundreds of small, irrevocable ways. Oliver's assistant adjusted to his new schedule. Monday mornings were no longer booked. They were reserved for walks to school. Business lunches gave way to art supply store visits. International calls ended promptly by bedtime. He still signed contracts, still managed boardrooms, still steered an empire. But now he did it with the awareness that something waited for him at home. Their evenings together became ritualistic. They cooked, though often burned things. They played board games, though Leah insisted on making up her own rules. Toby, the oversized mutt Oliver had adopted on a whim, became a fixture at their feet, loud, loyal, and impossibly tangled in every cable he could find. One evening, after another round of Leah's almost edible homemade pizza, she handed him a new drawing. This one showed not just her and Oliver, but Emma sitting in a garden, Toby chasing butterflies, and a simple caption scrawled across the top, "Family, even when no one's talking." The next day, Oliver visited Emma and gave her the drawing. She looked at it for a long time, her eyes filled not with envy or sadness, but with peace. She asked him if he was sure. He didn't answer. He just nodded. Eventually, Emma was released from the clinic and moved into a small apartment Oliver had arranged nearby. It was modest, warm, filled with sunlight, and stocked with everything she might need. Leah visited often, always bringing stories, drawings, and more often than not, cookies she and Oliver had half-baked the night before. Oliver continued to attend parent-teacher meetings. He sat in plastic chairs, listened to reports, watched as Leah's confidence bloomed. Her teachers spoke of a shift, the way she no longer kept to herself, the way she raised her hand now, the way she smiled. One of them commented on her heightened empathy, how she often gave her lunch to classmates who forgot theirs. Oliver knew why. She hadn't forgotten what it meant to need. One morning, as he tied her sneakers before school, she placed a small object in his pocket. It was a keychain, a plastic heart she had colored herself. On it, in block letters, she had written, "Dad." He said nothing, just squeezed her hand. The hotel continued to thrive. A new branch opened in Paris. Another was planned for Tokyo. But Oliver stopped attending grand openings. He preferred simpler launches now. Small gatherings, minimal press, fewer speeches. At one such event, Leah stood beside him in a soft blue dress, holding Toby's leash, beaming quietly. She didn't need the spotlight. She just needed to be present. During the closing of that ceremony, he took the stage only briefly. He said nothing about revenue or expansion. Instead, he held up a framed drawing, the one Leah had made months ago, the one with the lobby and the smiling guests. "This," he said simply, "is what matters." That night, they ate ice cream on the hotel rooftop. Leia dangled her legs over the edge of a lounge chair, watching the stars. Oliver leaned back, arms crossed behind his head, content. Toby snored between them, oblivious to everything but his own dreams. In the quiet, Leia said, "You don't run on contracts anymore." He smiled. She added, "You just run on love." He didn't correct her. She was right. In the end, it wasn't his wealth or success that defined him. It was the choice to open a door, not to a client or an investor, but to a little girl with a rag in her hand and dignity in her silence, and to choose her again and again, not out of duty, but from the heart. She was never temporary. She was the beginning of everything that was finally real. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to our channel. We share true, emotional stories that remind us of what truly matters. You can also explore our other videos for more stories about hope, resilience, and unexpected kindness. Before you leave, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We truly appreciate having you with us.